Today we're having a play with some beef ribs that we've got from Perry's of Eccleshaw. Now the beef ribs that we're going to be using today are going to be cut slightly differently to what you've probably been used to seeing them done. You'll have been used to seeing them in restaurants, and especially the barbecue restaurants, done British style, which is basically the flat long of the rib with the meat on top. We've got these cut flanken style, which essentially just means across the bone. If you go to Korean barbecue restaurants or more traditional faraway joints, you might see them cut this way, in which you've got the bones running through the meat, and then you've got the meat itself sort of sitting in between each bone, as you would if you were to look at the ribs within the animal from the sideways cut through. So what that does is it lends them to a slightly different style of cooking. This sort of British cut with the meat on top has a lot more of the connective tissue and the sinew between it and the bone. It lends itself to very slow cooking where that can render out and draw out the beefy flavours. So you'll generally see that cut low and slow on a barbecue, smoked or braised for a long period of time. These, because of how they're cut and because of how the meat is more exposed and you've got that delicious, more tender rib meat, takes on the rubs really well that you use and lends itself to a lot more cooking over the grill, you know, the barbecuing that people are traditionally used to in this country. So it makes for a very different experience. So hot heat and bold flavours work really, really well with this cut, whereas the slow, good salt, pepper, low, slow, beefy flavours and that type of cooking works much better with just the simple long ribs or short ribs. So we're going to be basically seasoning these up, and we're going to be throwing some simple spices on there that work with this type of cut and this type of cooking, and we're going to be throwing them over the coals, showing you that you can cook ribs quick, hot, and still maintain a lot of that tenderness. I mean, those pockets of meat are almost like little pockets of fillet or ribeye steak going between each one of the bones here. So this will be absolutely delicious. We're looking forward to this because this is one cut that you don't commonly get. So if you ask to have it cut by the butcher, essentially what the flanken style means is just flank along the side of it, coming from the side. So what we're seasoning with for these ribs is a little bit of coriander leaf, a little bit of pepper, salt, garlic granules and onion granules. I like to do all of my rubs very dry when I'm doing barbecue stuff, when I'm doing anything on the grill, because I like to control what sort of moisture I'm adding to it, and I like to just do dry rubs. We've got two different tastes which we're cooking for today. So one of them is going to be significantly less peppery with the rub than the other one. So it's very simple to just keep some pepper to the side and increase the strength of the rubs. With ribs, I like to start off with paprika dusting. It gets into the meat nicely, it gives it a nice colour, although you can't see a huge amount of the colour with beef. And just very liberally cover the open surfaces of the meat with the paprika. Basically that runs between, it protects the internal organs from the muscle and from the bone, so you tend to have the muscles connected with this connective tissue, this protective sheath that goes around it. So that's just a muscle from another part which would have another job, not related necessarily to the expansion and contraction of the ribs. Like with brisket, the brisket cut, the flat of the chest, there's a muscle underneath, a muscle on top, which is joined with the connective tissue, stops them kind of rubbing and adhering to each other. Because if you didn't have this connective tissue, these muscles, if they were going past one another, they'd have they'd stick, they'd rub. So that keeps everything nice and smooth so they can do their job of contracting, expanding and moving. Because that's what muscle tissue is, it's basically like stretchy, contractive tissue. So it works nicely to look after the internal parts. But that, for cooking, then gives us a challenge. We have to heat the meat to the point where this connective tissue, which isn't particularly nice to chew, gets rendered down, becomes tender. So on ribs, a lot of the time, on pork ribs, and I've got a video on this too, you tend to go along the ribs to get a really tender pork rib. When you're doing a rack of those, you'll take as much membrane, as much tissue off as you can. The less that there's there, the better the bite through comes. So you have a rib that you can bite and just pull the meat straight off. Brilliant. If that happens to come with a load of connective tissue, your experience with the ribs is way lower. So that's important as well. But yeah, in this case, it's just more muscle tissue. We could cut that off. If we were presenting this, if we wanted this to be something really sexy that we were giving to somebody to really show off, we could take all of this off and we could just leave as much bone as possible with none of this tissue. And you'd still have this like good chunk of meat, good chunk of meat, good chunk of meat with all this taken off. When we come to eat this ourselves, we are going to have to do a bit more work with our knives and forks, but this is home food. This is not going on a plate on a restaurant. This is going to be fed to us, and you know, the dogs will get those bits when they're cooked. We could cut them off and give them to the dogs now, but you know, it's personal preference as to how much you trim this meat off. So in times when I'm going to be teaching people how to prepare these like properly, we would go through every aspect of that, cutting off the excess. And it's a very wasteful process to bring like this piece of meat to a restaurant table is pretty wasteful, because we would be cutting off this here because there's membrane running between there, tissue running between there, so that would go. This would go along here, all of this would go. We'd probably look at this and go, right, we're going to chop it off here and just leave 1, 2, 3, 4 ribs where the fattest part of the meat is. And that is what would make it to the table with that cut off as well in front of a person. So you would get served 1, 2, 3, 4. From where my thumb is to where my thumb is what would make it to the table without any of this and without any of this as well. Because that is what people are going to want to eat. Yeah, that's what you're going to want put down on your table, piping hot, smelling amazing, with all your side dressings around it. So making good food is one thing, but making food which is really presentable and looks ace on the table is another. So what we're doing today is we're going to eat all of this. The chewy bits, the tender bits, everything. But yeah, that's sort of why food looks so different on a restaurant plate to why it looks the same at home. You've got a lot more to consider. Like when I give this to my mate Luke, he's not going to be upset that he's got a bit of extra meat on the side with some membrane holding it together. He's just going to rip it off and eat it. You know? And that's what happens. This is food you're serving for yourself, not put on a table at a restaurant. With that said, it's probably time that this gets put on the fire.